The smell hit first. Not rot, exactly, but heat, sweat, rusted metal, and something sweet rotting in the corners of the boxcar. When Marcus Webb forced the sliding door open, it screeched like it was crying. Inside, he expected machinery, or maybe livestock, but what he found stopped him cold. Shadows moved. A sound, barely audible, drifted from inside, a woman's breath that sounded like wind dragging across broken glass. 89 Japanese women, most of them barely alive, lay slumped on the wooden floor. Some stared at him, unmoving. Others didn't move at all. 3 were already dead. 12 days, no food, almost no water, locked in transit between camps, forgotten by a war machine too broken to remember them. And now a cowboy with a rifle on his shoulder stood staring into a mobile tomb. He took off his hat, and in that moment the story began, not of vengeance, not of punishment, but of something far more dangerous to propaganda: mercy. The heat was thick, even in the early morning. The metal siding of the abandoned train car shimmered under the Texas sun, warped from days of relentless exposure. The cattlemen weren't dressed for this. They had rifles slung low and dust on their boots, expecting maybe a broken axle, a loose cow, or the rusted corpse of some wartime equipment forgotten by the rails. Not this. Not 86 women inside a train car that smelled like sickness and metal and dried blood. Not 3 bodies already cold, their skin waxen in the shadows. Marcus Webb took a step back, blinking against the sun, trying to make sense of the figures inside. Thomas Riley, the older of the two, leaned against the boxcar's edge like the world had tilted underneath him. No one spoke. The air vibrated with cicadas and the low groan of heat off the earth. Inside, one of the women stirred. She was barefoot, her ankle no thicker than a man's wrist, and her uniform hung from her like it belonged to someone else. Her face was hollow, eyes too large, lips split. She looked up but didn't focus. There was no fear there, not even hope. Just vacancy. The men stepped back. "God Almighty," Thomas whispered. They didn't know what to do. Cowboys, ranch hands, men of order and dirt and fences, they were not medics, not soldiers. The boxcar had been left on a quiet siding near Fort Sam Houston, probably forgotten in the chaos of the final weeks of the war. Paperwork misplaced, orders lost. And inside, sealed shut, the women had waited. When they pried the second car open, the smell got worse. The floor was sticky in places. A dented tin cup sat in the corner near a bucket of stagnant water. It was all they had. One of the girls, maybe 16, was curled into herself in the far corner. Her arms were wrapped tight around her knees. She didn't move. Beside her, another girl leaned back against the wall, lips parted, breath so faint it was almost invisible. Riley turned and vomited in the dirt. This wasn't war. This wasn't combat or surrender or victory. This was starvation, quiet, forgotten, bureaucratic. They didn't come out when called. The women didn't have the strength. The cowboys brought water, slowly, carefully, not too much. One girl gagged after the first sip and vomited onto the wood floor. She began to cry, but the sound was dry, like someone trying to remember how. Then another sound rose. Not from the boxcar, but from behind the men. A train whistle in the distance, distant but sharp. The contrast was jarring. One train abandoned them, and another kept rolling. By mid-afternoon, help had arrived from the nearby army station. A medic cursed when he saw the scene. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, "they're barely alive." The women were lifted out one by one. Some resisted, unsure if the open air meant safety or punishment. One screamed, a ragged sound, hoarse and terrified, and fought until her limbs gave out. She had been clutching a sandal to her chest like a child might hold a doll. When they laid her on a stretcher, her fingers didn't unclench. Later, in the report, someone would write that the train had gone 12 days without a scheduled stop, that the manifest had been signed off at one camp, but never received by the next. That somewhere in the paper trail, these women, 89 of them, simply ceased to exist. 3 never made it to sunlight. The cowboys, hardened by cattle drives and long nights on the range, stood still in the dust. One held his hat in his hands. Another just stared at the ground, trying not to look at the bodies, at the bruises on the women's legs, at the raw pink of sunburned skin stretched over ribs. None of this made sense. They had been told these women were threats, that surrender was dishonor, that prisoners of war were dangerous. But there was nothing dangerous here. Only hunger, only silence, only human beings who had been left to die. We didn't know what day it was when the door finally opened. For a while we stopped counting. The sun had been gone for so long that time folded in on itself. It began, I think, with confusion. We were told to pack up for transport. Again, nothing new. A train arrived, and we were marched across the gravel yard in silence. 79 of us then. Another group of 10 joined at the next stop. A young girl vomited before she climbed aboard. The guards didn't even flinch. They closed the doors behind us with a clang like the ceiling of a tomb, and then they never opened again. The first day, we waited, sat shoulder to shoulder on the floor, the heat building with every breath. We thought it was just a delay. Military inefficiency. We were used to that. By the second day, the water ran out. A woman named Naomi tore a strip from her uniform to soak up condensation along the seams of the metal walls. She wrung it into her mouth. The rest of us watched her, not with judgment, but with envy. By day 4, the smell had changed. At first it was just sweat. Then it became something sweeter, heavier, like rotting fruit, or meat left out too long in the sun. The train didn't move anymore. No sounds from outside, no guards shouting, just the groan of metal in the heat and the slow, desperate breathing of the women around me. We tried not to move. Motion burned too many calories. Someone knocked once on the wall. Then nothing. I am Fumiko Tanaka. I was 23. Before the war, I worked as an interpreter in a government office in Yokohama. I learned English from a missionary who used to give us candies when we were children. I had a pencil in my pocket when we boarded the train. I used it to scratch tallies into the wood behind me, tracking the days. I stopped at 8, not because I lost the count, because I no longer believed it mattered. On the 7th day, a woman named Aya collapsed against the wall and didn't get up. Her breathing had been shallow for days, but when it stopped, no one said anything. We just looked. There was no screaming, no panic, just a silence so thick it felt like a blanket had been thrown over the whole car. Death didn't come like lightning. It came like fog. The air inside was thick. When we inhaled, it burned. Some women started whispering their own names out loud, over and over, just to remember who they were. I watched one woman trace the outline of her sister's hand on the floor with her finger again and again, even after her sister stopped responding. I began hallucinating around the 10th day. Or maybe it was earlier. I saw trees through the walls, a boy on a bicycle, a bowl of miso soup balanced on a windowsill, my mother's voice telling me to wake up for school. Every time I blinked, the world slid sideways. I would have cried, but I didn't have the water in me anymore. One night, a storm rolled in. Rain pelted the roof, and I tasted it. Tiny drops slipping through the seams in the ceiling. We held our hands out like children catching snowflakes. A few women began to laugh, not with joy, but with the jagged, cracked laughter of people already gone too far to come back. I didn't feel fear anymore. That left me around the 5th day. After that, it was just numbers: 79, 78, 76, the number of mouths still breathing, the number of hands still moving, the number of footsteps I imagined outside that never came. When the door finally opened, I didn't feel relief, just confusion. A man with sunburned skin and a rifle slung on his back stood in the light, blinking down at us. For a moment, I thought he was another vision. Then he swore under his breath and dropped to one knee, whispering something I couldn't understand. It was the first human voice I'd heard in days that didn't belong to someone dying. Yuki Yamamoto didn't hear the voice. Or maybe she did, but it didn't land inside her. Her eyes stayed open as the cowboy lifted her from the wooden floor, one arm under her knees, the other around her back. She weighed so little he thought she might snap. Her head lolled against his chest, but her eyes never closed. Not once. Not even when the sun hit her face. Not when the air changed. Not when he whispered, "You're all right now," in a voice that cracked halfway through. She didn't blink. They laid her on a patch of grass outside the train, under the shade of a cottonwood tree. Her hands curled toward her chest like claws. A medic checked her pulse and frowned. "She's dehydrated bad. Heart's weak. Probably hasn't spoken in days." They brought her water in a canteen, touched to her lips with slow precision. Her throat worked once, twice, but she didn't speak. She didn't cry. Her pupils tracked nothing. Inside her mind, she was somewhere else. The camp in Nagano was where it began, indoctrination wrapped in discipline. Yuki was barely 13 when she joined the Teishintai. She still remembered the first time they lined up and shouted the Emperor's name until their voices went hoarse. "Death before surrender," the instructor barked. "To be captured is to become dirt." She didn't know what capture looked like, but she believed him. Everyone did. Her older brother had gone to war 2 years earlier. His goodbye was a bull. He said, "Don't dishonor the family." Then he left with a rifle and never returned. By 15, Yuki was rolling bandages in a hospital carved into a hillside. The wounded boys screamed in their sleep. Some were missing limbs, others minds. One day she saw a girl her age pull a blanket over a soldier's face and whisper the death poem they were all taught. "Even in 100 years, I'll return to you as grass." Yuki had written her own death poem that night, folded it into her shoe, just in case. They were told the Americans would burn them alive. That surrender meant rape, mutilation, and shame worse than death. Yuki practiced biting her tongue hard until it bled. A nurse taught them how to hide a shard of glass in their sleeves. She kept one tucked in the lining of her uniform even after the war ended, even on the train, even in the boxcar, but she never used it because death never came like they promised. When the Americans found her, Yuki's body had already shut down everything except breath and memory. She was 16, but her eyes had seen enough for a lifetime. When the cowboy carried her, she expected to be dropped. When the water touched her lips, she expected to choke. When the medics examined her wounds, she braced for pain that never came. Instead, she was touched gently. A blanket was laid over her like it meant something. A hand brushed her hair back from her face. A voice said, "You're safe now." Safe. The word was unfamiliar. She thought of her training, of the black and white newsreels they watched of Americans with crooked teeth and snarling faces. She remembered the warning posters, women kneeling, their clothes torn, silhouettes of enemy soldiers behind them. She remembered her brother's last words. Now, Lying in the grass of a country she had been taught to fear, the only thing behind her was the empty boxcar and a man who had taken off his hat before lifting her. She didn't blink, because blinking was trust. Blinking meant safety. Blinking meant the world had changed, and Yuki Yamamoto wasn't ready to believe that yet. The others weren't either, not at first. As the surviving women were carried from the boxcars, their bodies limp and brittle, the cowboys and medics did what they could, one by one, lifting, laying, whispering words the women couldn't understand, but somehow still felt. Blankets were passed out, water rationed carefully. A medic named Jensen set up a canvas tent just beyond the siding, an impromptu triage station where the worst cases were laid on cots, their skin hot with fever or cold with shock. Fumiko lay still under her blanket as an IV slid into the vein of her arm. She didn't move, didn't ask questions. The needle didn't scare her. What scared her was that the man inserting it wasn't angry. His hands were clean. He wore gloves. He looked into her face like it mattered. 2 cots down, a girl named Ray flinched so violently at the touch of a medic's hand on her shoulder that she fell to the ground. She scrambled back on her elbows, eyes wide, breath catching in her throat like a trapped bird. The medic froze, hands raised. "It's all right," he said softly. "No one's going to hurt you." She didn't believe him. None of them did. When the broth came, thick, hot, carried in dented steel pots from the army kitchen, the women stared at it like it was poison. The scent of beef and carrots drifted across the camp like a dream. One woman whispered, "Is this a trick?" Another asked, voice raspy, "Where are the punishments?" The words were translated haltingly by a volunteer who spoke a little Japanese, and the Americans exchanged confused glances. Punishments? They didn't understand, but Fumiko did. She remembered the drills, the leaflets burned, the lectures, how they had been told surrender was not just disgrace, it was a guarantee of brutality. Captured women would be used, shamed, broken. That was the story. That was the warning. But this was something else entirely. The medics weren't laughing. The cowboys weren't pointing. One even knelt beside Yuki as she sat upright for the first time and held out a spoonful of soup like he was feeding his own child. Yuki didn't take it. She looked at it, then at him, then back at the spoon. Her mouth parted slightly, unsure. Then she leaned forward, just enough to take the sip. She didn't chew, just swallowed. Her eyes fluttered, not closed, not a blink, but something close, a shift. Ray was the first to speak. Not much, just a single word. Hot. She said it in Japanese, and when the medic tilted his head, she repeated it again in English, slower, testing it on her tongue. "Hot," he smiled. Not wide, just enough. She looked away quickly, as if ashamed of having spoken. Later that night, Fumiko sat on her cot and watched the shadows shift against the canvas walls. Around her, women were drinking water, lying under blankets, breathing. No one had been beaten. No one had been stripped or mocked. A woman beside her had been humming, softly, under her. Breath, until she realized it, and stopped. No one punished her. Fumiko pulled the edge of her blanket closer. Its weight was strange, comforting, heavy in a way that didn't hurt. She didn't know what this was, not yet. But it wasn't what she had been told, and that terrified her more than anything. When the soldier handed Fumiko the blanket, he didn't speak. He just set it gently beside her and nodded once before walking away. It was coarse, olive green, army-issued, but it was clean. It didn't smell of blood or mildew or rot. It smelled like sun-warmed canvas and soap. She reached for it slowly, half expecting a blow. When none came, she pulled it into her lap and stared. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't soft, but it was hers. And in that moment, something inside her cracked. She hadn't owned anything in months. Her clothes belonged to the army. Her body belonged to the war. Even her voice had been taken. But this folded square of warmth, felt like proof that she was still human. Around her, other women were being handed their own tokens, a piece of bread wrapped in a napkin, a bar of soap with the letters U.S. stamped into it, a tin cup with water that didn't taste like rust. One girl clutched her bread like it might disappear. Another asked if she was allowed to eat it now. No one knew the rules anymore. Some of them, despite exhaustion, still slept sitting up, backs against the canvas walls, hands folded, eyes half open, not because they had been told to, but because lying down without permission once meant punishment. That habit doesn't vanish with a blanket. Yuki Yamamoto had tucked the soap under her cot. She hadn't used it. She just stared at it, held it sometimes, smelled it. She didn't recognize the scent, but it was clean, familiar in a way that felt like childhood, before uniforms, before oaths, before war swallowed everything soft. Fumiko watched one of the younger women, Hana, run her fingers over the threads of her blanket for 10 minutes without looking up. And then, without warning, she began to cry. No sound, just tears. Her face blank, her breath slow. The kind of crying that comes not from pain, but from the absence of it. Fumiko understood, because what was happening around them didn't make sense. It didn't fit the narrative they'd been fed. Americans were devils, brutal, cold, inhuman. And yet, here they were, being handed bread, being covered at night, being addressed gently, like they mattered. The kindness felt like a trap, like it couldn't be real, and yet it kept coming. One of the medics brought tea, weak, sweetened with something like honey. When Fumiko drank it, it coated her throat like silk. Her eyes welled up without warning. She set the cup down and pressed the blanket to her face. There was a shame to survival, to being treated kindly by the enemy. She'd heard of women who bit off their own tongues to avoid capture. What would they think of her now? Wrapped in an American blanket, breathing American air, crying over tea given to her by a man she was supposed to fear? And yet, what else was there to do but live? She lay down that night, not because someone told her she could, but because the ground felt like it might forgive her. The stars above the canvas glowed faintly through the fabric, and for the first time in weeks she let her eyes close without resistance. In the dark, a quiet question began to grow in the space where fear used to live. Why are they being kind to us? Not just civil, not just strategic, but kind. She didn't have an answer, but she had a blanket, and that meant something. That meant she was alive. The sound came just after sunset, soft, unexpected, and strange. A twang, a rhythm, the kind of noise no one had heard in what felt like centuries. Fumiko sat up slowly on her cot, her blanket draped around her shoulders like armor, and listened. The notes drifted in from the porch of a nearby supply shack. It was a cowboy, Marcus Webb, the one with the sun-creased face, plucking the strings of a banjo. At first, no one moved. The music was too foreign, too gentle. It wasn't a warning siren. It wasn't boots stomping or commands barked in clipped syllables. It wasn't the buzz of flies over silence. It was melody. And then, inexplicably, one of the women laughed. A short burst, almost like a hiccup. Her hand flew to her mouth in shock, but the sound had already escaped. A few heads turned, then another woman began to sob. Not because the music was sad, but because it wasn't. It was the first sound they'd heard that didn't mean danger. Marcus didn't stop playing. Maybe he didn't even notice them listening. Or maybe he did, and played anyway. The notes of "Oh, Susanna" rolled into the dusk air, soft and aimless. Fumiko's fingers tightened on the edge of her cot. Her breath caught. Not because she knew the tune, but because it reminded her of something buried beneath months of fear. A shamisen. Her brother used to play one, the wooden body balanced on his knee, plucking the strings with a folded piece of ivory. He wasn't very good, but he smiled when he played, and their mother always sang along softly, washing rice at the sink. That was before the uniform, before the letter, before his name appeared on the shrine. Now here was another stringed instrument, halfway across the world, singing a different song, and for a moment it made her feel everything all at once. Around the tent, women sat up. Some turned toward the sound, others pressed blankets to their faces. The music wasn't loud, but it filled the space between them like water poured into cracked clay. They had been prepared for pain, for humiliation, for torture. But not this, not music. One girl whispered, "Is this allowed?" Another muttered, "Maybe it's a trick." But it kept playing, and slowly the fear began to falter. Fumiko closed her eyes. The notes didn't just fall on her ears, they slid into her chest, curled beneath her ribs, and uncoiled something she didn't know she'd buried. It hurt. But not the way starvation hurt, not the way silence hurt. This pain was sharp and sudden, like a cut from truth. Because if they could play music, if they could sit under a sky strummed with sound and not fear an order or a blow, then what else might be possible? The ideology she had worn like a skin began to itch. They had been told America was chaos, that its people were crude and cruel, that they would defile what they captured and laugh while doing it. And yet here was a cowboy with a crooked hat and a patched shirt playing lullabies, in the twilight, not for applause or control, but just because the day was ending. She opened her eyes again. Yuki was watching too. Her face unreadable, but her body leaned slightly forward like a flower toward light. In that moment, no one spoke of the emperor. No one whispered rules. No one recited oaths. They just listened. And somewhere, inside each woman, something began to bend. Not break. Not yet. But bend. That bend became something else the day a soldier handed Fumiko a pencil and a blank piece of paper. "You can write home," he said, gesturing gently to the table beside the mess tent. There were envelopes, more pencils, and a small tin of tea. She took the paper slowly as if it might vanish. Her fingers trembled. Write home? Home felt like another lifetime. Her mother bent over a garden in Kanagawa, her younger sister holding a rice ball too tightly in her fists, her father's quiet cough in the hallway at night. That home, that world, did it still exist? And what would they think if she told the truth? She sat beneath a tree near the edge of the camp and stared at the paper for a long time. The pencil felt heavier than it should have. Her other hand held her blanket tight around her shoulders, not because she was cold, but because it still reminded her she was here, alive. The first words came slowly. "Dear Mother," she paused. Was it still safe to call her that? Had her mother disowned her in shame, assuming her captured, dishonored dead? She kept writing anyway. "I am somewhere in Texas. It is quiet. I have not been beaten. I have not been starved. I was for a time, yes, on the train. But since being found, I have been given food, a blanket, even music." The pencil moved faster now. "They gave me soap. Real soap. I cried when I saw it. You would laugh, I think. Or maybe cry, too." They play music at night. One of the men played a banjo. I think that's what it's called. It sounds like water moving in reverse." She stopped. "That line would raise suspicion. I don't know what I am supposed to feel. I thought I would be punished. I thought I would be broken. But they keep offering help, and I don't understand it. I don't think I trust it. But it's real. The bread is real. The tea is real. The kindness is real. The words were dangerous, treasonous even." She could already imagine the clerk in Tokyo who would read this. A man with narrow eyes and a red stamp. He would scowl, maybe laugh, maybe toss it aside, or maybe he'd hold it up and say, "Do you see? Even they know our defeat." "Still," she wrote, "I don't know what they will do with this letter. Maybe you'll never see it, but I wanted to write anyway, because if I don't, then the truth disappears, and I can't let that happen, even if the truth is confusing, even if it makes me ashamed, or grateful, or both." That night, when she handed the letter to the soldier, he nodded once and folded it into an envelope. She watched it vanish into the pile with the others. In Tokyo, months later, an intelligence officer opened a letter like that. He read about music, about blankets, about kindness from the enemy. He didn't speak, just folded the page and placed it in a restricted file. But a secretary saw it. A clerk passing by glimpsed the handwriting. A rumor grew. Not all prisoners are mistreated. Not all enemies are monsters. The ripple began there, quiet and invisible, like the sound of a shamisen in a storm, and Fumiko, back in Texas, lay on her cot and stared at the stars through the crack in the canvas and wondered if truth could be its own kind of rebellion. She decided it could, because in a world built on lies, a letter too honest could be the most dangerous thing of all. The next morning, the kitchen doors creaked open, and Fumiko stepped inside, not as a prisoner but as a helper. No one ordered her to. No one expected her to. But one of the ranch hands had made a joke the night before about how none of them could cook rice, and she'd raised an eyebrow. A few of the women laughed. So now, here she was, sleeves rolled up, stirring pots, teaching a cowboy how to steam white rice without turning it to paste. Yuki had taken to organizing tins on the supply shelf. She still didn't talk much, but she nodded more. Sometimes she smiled, not wide, but real. One of the cowboys had brought her a packet of playing cards, and now, each afternoon, she sat with him and watched as he taught her how to play a game called gin rummy. The name alone made her laugh the first time she heard it. Every action now had layers, every moment folded in on itself. They weren't just washing dishes, they were dismantling something. Because no one had told them they were people before. Not really. They were tools, assets, bodies to obey and, if needed, to be discarded. Honor had meant obedience. Obedience meant silence. And silence had nearly killed them. But here, in the middle of Texas, they were being seen. It was disarming and disorienting. Fumiko didn't know what to do with the fact that the cook, George, a widower with stiff knees and kind eyes, kept asking her how she liked her eggs, or that he let her taste the stew before serving it. That small gesture, a spoon held toward her, waiting for her opinion, carried more dignity than any title she'd ever been given. But it also stirred guilt. If the Americans could see them as human, why hadn't their own commanders? Why were they left in that boxcar, forgotten like rations or scrap? Why was kindness the enemy and survival a shame? Yuki asked no questions, but her eyes were full of them. She sat one evening beneath a cottonwood tree, cards fanned between her fingers, watching the sun set like a fire across the horizon. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. "Who am I now?" She had been ready to die, expected it, accepted it. Death was supposed to be her final act of loyalty. But now she was learning card games, eating stew, smiling. The women didn't talk much about what they were feeling, but it hung between them like steam. At night, when someone hummed softly in her sleep, no one shushed her. When laughter came, it wasn't suppressed. But when silence fell, it was heavier than before. Because now they knew what it meant to live. And that knowledge changed everything. In this strange new routine, helping in the kitchens, folding laundry, sipping weak coffee, they were reclaiming something stolen. But what replaced the silence wasn't just joy, it was confusion, a soft, aching identity crisis. If mercy was real, then what had all the cruelty been for? If the enemy could be gentle, then what had their own leaders turned them into? And beneath every meal, served, every blanket folded, every laugh that escaped before it could be swallowed, came that haunting question again. If they see me as human? What was I before, and who am I now? Are you finding this story as powerful as we do? If so, please like the video and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Yuki found her answer by accident, standing in the dirt with a metal bucket and a nervous calf. One of the ranch hands had gestured toward the pasture that morning and said something she didn't understand, but the meaning was clear enough. Feed them, care for them, trust them. It was absurd, really. She had been trained to endure starvation, to face death without flinching, and now she was being handed grain for cattle. The calf approached slowly, its ribs faintly visible beneath its hide, its breath warm and damp against her wrist. Yuki froze. Animals back home had been scarce in the final years of the war. Horses were taken, dogs disappeared, hunger stripped everything. She held out her hand, palm open, grain resting there like an offering. The calf leaned forward and licked her. Its tongue was rough and wet, leaving a streak of slobber across her skin. For a heartbeat, Yuki just stared. Then something unexpected happened. A sound burst out of her chest, sharp, sudden, unguarded. Laughter. She clapped her free hand over her mouth, shocked. But it was too late. The sound had already escaped, light and bright and completely unashamed. The calf blinked at her, unconcerned, and licked her again. Yuki laughed louder. It startled everyone. Fumiko looked up from the fence line, eyes wide. One of the cowboys froze mid-step, then grinned. No one told her to stop. No one looked offended. No one reminded her of dignity or shame. For the first time in months, Yuki laughed without guilt. The war, the boxcar, the hunger, the screams in the dark, they all seemed to recede in that moment, not disappear, but soften, as if the world had cracked open just enough to let something warm through. She fed the calf, slowly, deliberately. Her hands were steadier now. Her shoulders, once permanently hunched, relaxed. When the bucket emptied, she stayed there anyway, letting the calf nose at her fingers, grounding herself in the weight of its presence. This was life, simple, stupid, alive. That night she told Fumiko about it. Not with words, she still didn't trust them, but with gestures and a shy smile and a sound that hovered somewhere between a laugh and a breath. Fumiko understood. She always did. Hope didn't arrive with speeches or promises. It came quietly, in a field, with an animal that didn't care about flags or uniforms or enemies. Yuki slept deeply that night. She dreamed of green fields and running water, and her brother's laughter before the war taught him how to disappear. When she woke, her hands no longer shook. The next days passed gently. She fed the cattle again, learned their names, learned that one liked apples and another hated noise. She began to hum while she worked, not a song she recognized, but a tune that felt like it belonged to her. The girl who wouldn't blink had started to look away from the past. Fumiko watched her with quiet awe. She saw in Yuki something she herself was still struggling to name, a rebirth that didn't race the pain, but made space around it. If Yuki could laugh, truly laugh, then maybe survival didn't have to feel like betrayal. Maybe it could be something else, something earned. The Cowboys noticed it too. They spoke of her differently now, not as one of the prisoners, but as the quiet girl with the cattle, the one who smiled when the calf followed her like a shadow. History wouldn't remember that calf. No record would note its rough tongue or clumsy affection. But for Yuki Yamamoto, that moment became the line between who she had been and who she might become. Hope didn't shout. It didn't march. It licked her hand and made her laugh. The day the trucks returned, there was no warning, just a cloud of dust at the edge of the horizon and the dull thrum of engines cutting through the silence of the ranch. Fumiko stood beside the laundry line, a sheet still in her hands, and felt something shift in the air. Yuki stopped brushing the calf and slowly turned toward the road. Others gathered without being called, drawn by instinct, by the quiet, knowing that the end of something had arrived. The officials who stepped out of the trucks wore pressed uniforms and distant eyes. They moved with the certainty of people who had paperwork in their hands and schedules to keep. They said little, asked names, checked boxes. They didn't notice the way the women's postures were different now, how they stood straighter, moved slower, looked people in the eye. When the women had first arrived, they couldn't even walk. Now, most of them stepped toward the trucks on their own. Not with joy, not with bitterness, just with the solemnity of those who had survived something that hadn't yet finished explaining itself. Some carried satchels, others held journals or scraps of paper. All clutched their blankets like lifelines. Yuki's braid had grown long enough to tie with a ribbon, one given to her by the same cowboy who'd taught her cards. She tucked it beneath her collar, out of view, but close enough to touch. Fumiko carried a letter folded 3 times, written in English and sealed with wax. It was from George, the cook, who had never once said he was sorry, but had always looked her in the eye when he handed her a bowl. One by one, the women climbed into the trucks. No tears, no embraces, just the sound of boots against metal and breath held just a little too long. The cowboys stood in a loose row. None spoke. One chewed a piece of grass, another tipped his hat, slowly, once. It was enough. More than enough. Fumiko turned as she stepped up into the truck. Her eyes scanned the porch where she'd once sat in silence, listening to music she didn't understand. She let the image burn into her mind. The porch rail chipped at the corner, the bucket still beside the steps, the banjo leaning against the doorframe. Then she faced forward. But in her pocket, hidden deep and protected, were 3 things: the letter from George, Yuki's ribbon, and a folded piece of paper with a childlike drawing, an uneven sketch of a cow licking a girl's outstretched hand. That drawing was a truth the war had tried to erase. They didn't know where they were going next. The officials hadn't said. Another camp, probably. Maybe better, maybe worse. But it didn't matter as much now, because something had changed in them. They had arrived as ghosts, silent, weightless, half-human things shaped by fear and propaganda. But they walked out as women, alive. In a war that consumed identities, erased names, and reduced people to numbers, they had reclaimed something invisible but undeniable: personhood. They had laughed, written, cared for animals, smiled without asking permission. That was their quiet rebellion. The trucks pulled away slowly, wheels kicking up dust that curled and twisted in the morning light. No one waved. No one needed to. They had already said everything that mattered in silence. If this story moved you, please like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And thank you for remembering a piece of history the world nearly forgot.